It's a pleasure to be here this morning talking about something that I've been talking about for some time and that I really believe in, and the world is really catching up to climate change, and internal audit should be catching up to climate change as well to really add some value and protect our companies. I enjoyed the presentation we just heard from Crow, and was really enjoyed the question that somebody posed about, well, where is compliance and where is monitoring? And I completely agree with the answer that it does occur in second line as well. I have experience with it in procurement auditing, environmental auditing. Besides the management functions, there's a lot of auditing functions, including auditing of climate, which we'll get to in a moment. No self-respecting presentation. Let's see how I advance here. There we go. No self-respecting consultant will do a presentation without a disclaimer. So there's a disclaimer. This does not constitute a consulting service, and it's really my impressions and not necessarily of any official body that I'm affiliated with or of any client. The objectives today are going to be to let's get internal audit familiar with many of the requirements and reporting and disclosure frameworks. Some of this we've heard before, some of the recent developments and trends, and to get folks in internal audit to really see the connection and relevance and the urgency for internal audit to get involved. And in order to do that, our agenda there is we'll look at some background laws, some trends in assurance, and some perspectives that I'll just offer of my own on internal audit and how internal audit should step up pretty quick to get involved and to add value and to protect the reputation and the value of our organizations. So with that, here's a polling question. There's kind of a lot on here, but I think that goes to the fact that there are. So some background on climate change. The map here was from originally the New York Times, which compiled it from a number of different studies showing the type of climate-related risk by area in our country. So everyone is affected in some way by climate-related risk. We've seen wildfires, we've seen rain, we've seen drought in California, we've seen a lot, but everybody is seeing something. And so what is the risk? What is the adaptability? What are the costs? What are the planning that should go to, let's say, governments or companies that operate in any of these areas? Everybody's got something. So climate-related developments or events can pose significant risk to organizations in the short, medium, and long term. It can pose risks affecting operations, affecting compliance, and affecting financial performance. The concepts here in many of the disclosure frameworks, you'll see the request for organizations to disclose their plans in the short, medium, and long term. So that's a concept to get used to. Organizations may need to define those on their own and to disclose those definitions. In operations, compliance, and financial performance, for anyone who knows COSO, those are the columns in the slices in the famous COSO cube. So that should be very familiar to folks here in internal audit and who work in this area. Stakeholders want reliable, comparable, decision-useful information. Investors are really driving the bus at the moment with requests for disclosures to the common capital markets. They want information that is quantitative and qualitative. The easiest example of quantitative information is a greenhouse gas emissions inventory. There's also quantitative information requested for greenhouse gas emissions reductions, on expenditures for greenhouse gas emissions projects, on goals and targets. And what we're also seeing, what's also in the standards, are requests for information on progress towards goals and targets. Qualitative information includes a description of governance, strategy, and of risk assessment processes and the outcomes of risk assessments. This slide should be familiar to folks, and if it's not, it should become familiar very soon on the types of greenhouse gas emissions. This is from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is really the gold standard for how greenhouse gas emissions are categorized and how greenhouse gas emissions are calculated. I think it's a very good graphic. I've explained it a little more here on this slide. Scope 1 emissions come from direct combustion. If you burn anything, you are generating a Scope 1 greenhouse gas emission. You can burn oil, gasoline, natural gas in vehicles, in boilers, in heaters, water heaters, cooking devices, backup power generators. We combust a lot as a society, and those are all greenhouse Scope 1 emissions. Scope 2 are indirect emissions that come from combustion that we have purchased. We purchase electricity. Well, that was generated, most of it, by the combustion of something, whether it's coal, natural gas, propane, what have you. You can also purchase steam or purchase cooling. In buildings, it's not uncommon for companies to purchase HVAC services. You purchase the air conditioning as measured by the amount of cooling capacity that is provided to you by the building owner. That's purchased energy because somewhere a fuel was combusted in order to provide that cooling. Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions are often discussed together. Let's see, I wasn't quite ready for that. Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions are often discussed together. They're generally considered the easier ones to compile. They might be easier, but they are not easy. Scope 3 is everything else that affects your organization, upstream and downstream. There are 15 categories within Scope 3. Upstream includes business travel, employee commuting, transportation and distribution for products for all up and down the supply chain. Downstream includes transportation and distribution of your products to your customers and the like. Use of products, end-of-life disposal, it really just includes everything. And everybody is somebody else's Scope 3. You'll see this come into play on some of the reporting frameworks we'll discuss here momentarily, that if you sell anything to anybody, you're in their supply chain, and you'll be in one of those categories for their Scope 3. So we'll stop here for a moment and do the next polling question. And it's my contention that sooner or later, everybody will have to do that. So if your organization has not compiled one, I would say right away, that's a risk that you should focus on and see where that might be used and what that might be costing the company in terms of, for private sector companies, for customers or reputation, and for governments just to be responsive with public policy and some things that you'll have to do to plan. And for everybody else, I encourage you to work your way up that chain there, because sooner or later, you'll have to, I think, get at least to category B. Some companies are going further than that, and we'll see how that goes. So now let's turn our attention for a minute to some of the laws, regulations, and standards. I presented on this before. These are just some of the more recent developments. The Paris Climate Accord goes back to 2015, but that established agreements on the part of countries across the globe to strengthen the response to climate change, what different countries had to commit to in order to limit the temperature increase to no more than 1.5 degrees centigrade. The atmospheric temperature is really what's driving a lot of the changes. So many things have been cascading effects of this, including many of the things here on this slide. The Sustainability Accounting Standards Board began about a dozen years ago. It's now merged into the International Sustainability Standards Board. SASB and ISSB is focused on the demands of the common capital markets, the stock exchanges, and investors. SASB includes climate disclosures, related disclosures as a material risk for most sectors. And these are topics for the common investors. The Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD, took SASB one step further and established 4 different categories of disclosures: governance, strategy, risk management, metrics and targets. And I think it's noteworthy that the TCFD was not established by the Sierra Club or the tree huggers or the Save the Whales people. TCFD was established by the Financial Stability Board and the G20 because they know that climate-related risk poses a risk to financial stability and to companies' ability to continue to perform financially. As of next year, I think it is, in the UK, disclosures on TCFD will become mandatory. The International Sustainability Standards Board, the IFRS, which governs accounting pretty much worldwide, except in the US, where we operate under US GAAP, it got on the bandwagon and established a standard-setting body that will has 2 exposure drafts out since last year. They're expected to be final here by June of this year. One exposure draft is on disclosures of all things sustainability related. The second one is on climate only. So I suggest that that is one indication that climate really does stand on its own, and it's worth a focus in any organization on risk management and disclosures. The SEC got in on the act, not just last year, but they got in on the act in 2010 when they published guidance on disclosures of climate-related risk. And absent a lot of companies, many companies actually disclosing their climate-related risks, the world, the Paris Climate Accord, and the interest and the extreme weather events really drove the SEC to propose the rule last year. We did a webinar here at IIA on that last April. That webinar is on my website, DouglasHeileman.com. And we're expecting to see SEC drop a final rule here, I would say in the next 60 days. And shortly after that, we may do another flash webinar here at the chapter so you can learn about what is real and what changed since the proposals. Something that may have be a bit of a sleeper is the federal acquisition regulation. It's the case now where some contractors must indicate if they publicly disclose and report their greenhouse gas emissions. And if you say yes, you've got to provide the link, and that link has to work and to be maintained. There's a proposal out that would require suppliers in 2 different categories to meet different requirements. If your company does more than $7.5 million of business with the federal government, then the disclosure, the public reporting of scopes 1 and 2 would be required. If your company does more than $50 million of business, that's required, plus disclosures according to TCFD, portions of the CDP, which is formerly the Carbon Disclosure Project, and the contractor must develop and submit science-based targets and have these targets validated by SBTI, which is the Science-Based Targets Initiative. So all of this is part of the administration's whole government approach, where they are talk about collaboration, as we did in the last session here. It's not just the Department of Energy or the EPA or the Department of Commerce or any single department of the government acting in a disjointed fashion. It's the entire government is focusing on issues that are relevant to the country and acting in more collaboration. Well, nobody buys more goods or services in this country than the federal government. So what we're seeing here is a reflection on that will tug much of the economy along. And as we saw in TCFD, many of those provisions reach back to the supply chain of those contractors. So if you're a company that sells, if you're 1 or 2 or 3 tiers back in the supply chain to a big supplier, this will eventually hit you. The CDP has been a voluntary disclosure since 2000. The disclosures are publicly available. CDP grades the disclosures and posts them on the website. I've just read through the disclosure forms for 2023. It was 100 and some pages of reading. I expect to post something on my website on takeaways for this year's disclosure. They involve a lot of narrative. The one thing that I'm seeing in CDP, which I'm seeing many other places, is a drafting behind the concept of comply or explain. In the CDP questionnaire for this year, there are several things like disclose or explain. For example, disclose the company's risk management assessment process for climate-related risk. Disclose whether the company, the reporting entity, reaches out to its supply chain for greenhouse gas emissions reporting and how they're managing climate-related risk. And then if the answer is we don't, the next question is, please explain why you don't do this and when you expect to start this. So you can't just not tick a box anymore or say we don't do that. You must provide narrative in terms of why you do not do this and when you expect to start. Now, mind you, the CDP feeds into, it is public. It's what analysts look at. One of the many things analysts look at for the financial markets. It's one of the things that the federal government will look at in the FAR regulations. So CDP does have teeth. The CDP allows first-time submitters to make their reports private, but for the second year or more, CDP will make all of those reports public. So it's not going to a government entity, but this is a public disclosure that I suggest is kind of a sleeper in many companies because it's not going to the SEC, but it is public. GRI has been around for 20 years or more. This was the first sustainability reporting framework. It's a general all-purpose framework. It includes many disclosure topics, but beginning notably for this year, reports released in 2023 that cover the 2022 reporting year. There's the encouragement that the GRI reports must be subject to assurance in order to say the reports are in accordance with GRI. Companies, reporting entities have been able to use that term relatively freely over the years without really having any double check there, but now that has to be assured. For publicly traded companies, anybody involved in investor relations or sustainability is very familiar with the analyst community, Sustainalytics, EcoVadis, Moody's, S&P. These analysts review reporting and disclosures for sustainability and ESG topics. They rate them, they grade them, they rank them, they provide them to all the major investors. The analyst community expects transparency on the part of companies doing the reports. The analyst community is not always transparent on how they review and evaluate the reports, but nonetheless, they do request a lot of this information, and how they view it can affect their reports and analysis and the investment decisions of many of the big investment houses. So some trend in assurance. Everybody wants the data be right. Well, how can you tell if the data is right? There's a very interesting report out called The State of Play in Reporting in Assurance of Sustainability Information. The reporting is doing gangbusters across greenhouse gas, environmental, social governance. Everybody's reporting. The assurance varies widely, with greenhouse gas really coming up top of the list. That assurance is done by a number of different providers. There's something like 40, 50 of primarily technical companies who do different assurance standards for greenhouse gas emissions. And the countries in percent by obtaining assurance in 2020 are really all over the world. And US, even though it's not mandatory, we ranked in the top 5. So I think that tells you, something good. The SEC rule would require attestation of the greenhouse gas emissions reporting, first scopes 1 and 2, and scope 3 maybe a little bit later. We'll see how that fares in a final rule. And there's several instances here where assurance is really encouraged. I'm skeptical as to whether or not the people asking for assurance know what they really are asking for or how they use it. But still, the demand and the pull is there. ISO has a standard for greenhouse gas emissions verification standard. There are about 50 providers worldwide. So there are a lot of different ways to do assurance, and what that assurance consists of and how well it's done might be a good fodder for an internal audit consideration. So for the internal audit professionals in the room, how can internal audit add value? What should internal audit do to add value? And what if internal audit doesn't do it? What if internal audit continues to kind of sit on the sidelines, has been my experience that internal audit has done for a while. So I talked to this group, as a matter of fact, all the way back in October 2010 on various perspectives for climate change risk and internal audit. And many of these things still hold true, but in the right-hand column, I have a series of updates. Some suggestions that I would say internal audit do today. There is the matter of compliance. The risk of compliance will continue to expand, including regulatory and contractual. The tendency, the temptation is for compliance to look in the Federal Register, to look at laws and regulations. But climate change, I would say, is something that is a global issue. So the global standards start to apply. If you're a company that does business globally, whether directly or in your value chain or in your supply chain, the compliance regulations are creeping outside the four corners of the organization that you control. And compliance requirements are going into aspects that you are expected to influence. There's the matter of product conformity of what can and cannot be in products. California has the Transparency in Supply Chain Act. Germany is coming up with a Due Diligence Act that will affect any company that sells into Germany in the value chain. In the US, within the last year or so, there's been the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act that has resulted in many goods being held at the ports and not admitted to the country because their importers cannot demonstrate that the products were not made using forced labor from the Uyghur region of China. So the whole, and there are compliance requirements with customers, and the customers are now doing audits up the supply chain. And I've seen instances where companies have been at risk of losing up to 30% of their revenues because they were not doing good enough on supplier audits by their customers. So compliance is really creeping in from all over the place, almost faster than compliance departments or organizations can keep track of them, and they can manage them and keep up. In terms of operations, climate change affects many aspects of operations. There's lighting, replacing bulbs, efficiency of heating, transportation, business travel. All of this is still true. Companies have had programs for many years to reduce energy use. And my observation is that a lot of the easy projects are done. The demand is continuing to increase, and identifying projects and ways to reduce energy or to smooth out supply chains or to ensure compliance in supply chains is getting harder. There's more of a life cycle approach to organizations. It's not just what you do, but who you engage with upstream, who you engage with downstream, and how you exert influence both ways. So, and that is a part of operations. Even 13 years ago, 12, 13 years ago, the disclosures to capital markets was really taking front and center with the SEC's guidance in 2010. Well, that is true, and that's growing really dramatically. That I do expect to see a climate disclosure rule sometime next quarter. We'll see the same thing from ISSB. And regardless of whether the states have indicated they will challenge the SEC final climate rule, the market will demand it, and many of the market participants will do it. As I've mentioned, that those requirements are kind of porous, so that those requirements will find their way up the supply chain. We're seeing many different standards kind of come with many of the same topics. For organizations trying to get some green funding or discounts on investments because of their green performance, the capital markets, the banks, impact investors will expect these disclosures, and many of these disclosures get back to the same thing, the same topics: governance, strategy, risk management, metrics, and targets. And the metric that comes first is the greenhouse gas emissions inventory. You'll see that time and time again. Governance. Here we are on governance, strategy, and risk management. These are three of the pillars, I might call them, three of the four pillars of the TCFD and of many of the disclosure frameworks. Back in 2010, one of my contentions was that climate change really doesn't have a home. And we saw here moments ago in the polling question that it still doesn't have a home. That really needs to change. If there's no home for climate change related risk and compliance, then you can have no control over it and you can't manage the risk. It really needs a home. There has been some progress on this. On the governance side, more and more boards are assigning climate change risk to a committee. In some cases, it's an audit committee. Some cases, it's a compliance committee. In some cases, boards are creating special purpose committees for ESG in general or for climate change in particular. But beyond the board, in terms of where it's showing up in companies or at organizations, there's some improvement there, but it is also still evolving. One of the things I've seen here recently that's interesting is that some companies are now appointing an ESG or sustainability controller, so that it's a position on par with the CFO, but looking at how finance interacts with the world of ESG and in particular climate-related risk, because the markets just are demanding the information. And the more people look into it, the more they see there are different places where the risk shows up, and it's not really being aggregated in a way that presents the true picture of climate-related risk to the organization. On terms of strategy, it's really wasn't on the radar for companies on how they reduce emissions or how they mitigate risks or what they do. There is some progress on that as companies are forced to disclose information. It's forcing them to think about their strategy. In my experience in working in-house in industry and for Big Four and just watching the compliance world in general, it's been my experience that companies are fairly well, they get into a good rhythm when there's a new law or regulation passed. It goes to legal, goes to operations, it goes various places in the company. What do we have to do to comply? What are the deadlines? When something comes in as a requirement, there are ways that it just works its way through the system and eventually everything gets done. Climate-related risk and sustainability and ESG in general has been a little different in that the demand for the information, if you think about any kind of management system, any kind of governance framework, even COSO, the internal control framework, that communications and reporting is one of the things that does last. That's at the end of the line. Well, the reporting has been the pull rather than a push from on in. So companies have been challenged on, well, how do we report something if we don't have anything? So the requirement to disclose about strategy is forcing companies to think about their strategy. And I am seeing more improvement in that area as well as risk management. If companies have to think about risk, disclose on risk management, they have to delve into what those risks are. And the CDP questionnaire in particular, I think offers a pretty good taxonomy on where companies can look for climate-related risk. IT, there's so much data, there's so much information around climate-related risk, and greenhouse gas emissions is really just the start of it, but it has come a long way. There are many vendors offering commercial solutions on climate-related risk and climate-related data. I'm skeptical of many of them, to be honest, because they promise to link everything directly to the accounting system, so you can just pull whatever you need from the accounting system. And having worked on a few greenhouse gas emissions inventories, you go to the accounting system and it's just not there. So getting information from an accounting system sounds very promising, but it does highlight the fact that some of the data just isn't ready. Which leads into the next point, that there are risks for incomplete and unsubstantiated data. This is true, somewhat less and somewhat more than it was before. My observation is that the demand for data has increased. The demand for relevant and decision useful data has increased. It's tough to slice and dice data to meet the needs of many different users. We have governments interested in greenhouse gas emissions by jurisdiction. We have capital markets interested in greenhouse gas emissions by company. They're also interested in the intensity of greenhouse gas emissions, your emissions, let's say, by revenue or by number of products sold. So that creates a number of different situations. And customers are interested in the greenhouse gas emissions for the products they buy. So all of that is different variations on data that has to be compiled and kept someplace with the right tags and the right attributes and the right controls over this data, so you can give the right information to the right user and be responsive to those requests, to be in compliance with contracts and laws and regulations, to remain in favor with the investors, and to be confident in the data. The Greenhouse Gas Emissions Protocol also has a provision, as does the CDP, that once you start reporting, you are expected to report emissions in prior reporting periods to show trends. If you identify errors in prior reporting periods, there are procedures to go back and restate those emissions, very much like doing a re-audit. If you find errors in prior reporting periods, there are also provisions where if a company changes its boundaries, if there's an acquisition, if there's a divestiture, then you go back and recalculate so that you have a better sense of trends over time, so that you can compare like for like, including for prior reporting periods. So I hope by now people have understand on this call that there are risks, and some of the risks sound kind of scary, but really, if you think about it, they're a lot like risks that internal auditors are accustomed to dealing with before. What is the completeness? What is the accuracy of data? What are the compliance requirements? What are our operational risks? What are our compliance risks? Are we prepared? Are we ready for the laws and regulations or the standards or the expectations from customers that are about to hit us? For anybody who lived through Sarbanes-Oxley 20 years ago, that's exactly what internal audit was doing. And I would suggest maybe even that there's a role for internal audit departments to play around the notion of internal controls over sustainability reporting, where you can set up a little shop and do some testing, evaluate the design, and evaluate the effectiveness of controls over all this reporting, notably around climate. So here's a little graphic on perspectives and how we got to where we are today. It covered most of this in prior slides. One thing that's kind of interesting is SEC has a proposal out for a truth in ESG labeling for funds. The FTC has a proposal out to revise their green guides for products and services that are marketed with green claims. I do encounter a lot of private companies who think this doesn't really apply to them. Climate doesn't apply to us, or ESG doesn't apply to us because we're private. We're not affected by the disclosure rules. There are so many different aspects of the disclosure rules that affect supply chains that if you're selling to any public company, sooner or later, this will get you. You cannot engage with customers if you are oblivious to these requirements, and you're going to have to put together a greenhouse gas inventory at a minimum. And risk is risk. Whether or not you have to disclose a description of how you have identified and you're managing climate-related risk, if your peer companies are doing it, if your customers are doing it, risk is risk. And to a private company, I would say if you're ignoring that, then you kind of do that at your peril. So it's just good risk management practice. So there's a lot internal audit can do on the assurance side. There's a lot that can do on the advisory side when it comes to compliance, reporting and disclosures, readiness, and for assurance engagements and assurance engagements. I'm a big advocate for internal audit, and I really think internal audit can do a lot in the way of consulting or advisory engagements, much more than it does today. For example, I think there's a certain tendency or a certain reluctance to wade into something if we don't really know the criteria, if we don't really know what's expected, if we're not really confident about what we're looking for. But the climate world is wide open. There are many standards and criteria. They might look foreign to you when you look at it, but many of the concepts are familiar. It's very common to engage a specialist to help steer on these engagements, to ask the right questions. to get a good sense of what you're looking at, to get a good sense of what you're looking for, and to sort through the things that can be the most impactful in terms of how internal audit can protect the reputation of your organizations and add some value, and to be prepared for the compliance requirements and for the disclosure standards that are around the corner. My other observation is that for companies who sit tight and wait until everything is absolutely required, you just will not have the time to do it all by the established deadline. So we have one more polling question here. Now I think you can pick two. If anybody says there's an answer down there at the bottom that if you answer that one, I think, Tina, can we withhold the CPE for the session? That I think there's one answer here that is not a good answer.
Doug, you have a question in the chat room. And
okay, good.
Since CCC doesn't have a home,
is to get internal audit thinking about what you can do. If it's a matter of where do you add value first, and you can come up with two, nothing says you can only do one engagement in a year. If you haven't done an engagement in a couple of years or at all, the nature of this risk and the number of places this issue is coming at the organizations, and the number of places organizations have to engage with on this issue is such a sprawling situation, and in many cases a mess. It's hard to think that you could get your arms around all of that in one engagement. The company can't do it as one project, so internal audit shouldn't feel limited in doing this as one project either. Just look at what the need is, look at where you can add value. Don't feel constrained about the fact, where's the checklist, where's the protocol. Just jump in and get familiar with it at your organization.